and I was younger, I worked at those adult superstores. If you've ever traveled along the highway, you've probably seen the old, worn-out billboards advertising similar places. Or if you live in a busy city, you might even have one tucked away near your neighborhood. Most of these stores follow the same basic concept, selling all kinds of explicit merchandise. I won't go into detail, but you can use your imagination. Let's just say it's not exactly a place you take your kids, which is why they're called adult stores, after all. With such an outrageous collection of products, you can probably guess the kind of crowd that came through the doors. Not exactly the most refined clientele, but there was certainly a demand for it. To be fair, not everyone who shopped was a complete oddball. Some were a little eccentric, sure, but not necessarily bad people. My parents warned me to steer clear of those, and begged me not to work at what they saw as a disgraceful store. But for once, I ignored their advice and made a decision for myself. It wasn't all awkward encounters, though. I remember one particular day when a new little walked in. They couldn't have been older than 23. Watching them, I felt a twinge of envy. They were so happy, completely wrapped up in the little honeymoon phase. The presence even caught the attention of some of our regulars. Mostly awkward, self-proclaimed loners in their mid-20s, making the kind of purchases you'd expect. But the young couple was sweet. The bride picked out some lingerie for their honeymoon, along with a pack of condoms, and they were on their way. It was rare to see both halves of a couple shopping together. More often, it was just husbands picking out gifts for their wives. Though in reality, those gifts were more for themselves. I didn't mind, of course. I was making my 5th an hour. 1994 wages, mind you. But not every customer was easy to deal with. Sometimes as a socially awkward guy with neck beer looking for a very specific type of, entertainment. Thankfully, we carried 6 different versions and 4 different skin tones. Other times, it was an older couple hoping to spice things up, though I usually steered away from anything too adventurous. And every now and then, a clueless family on a road trip would wander in, assuming we sold toys for kids. Technically, we did sell toys, but not the kind little Timmy would want. And somehow, it was my fault that Mom and Dad failed to read the giant signs plastered all over the building. Then, there was the day everything changed. At first, it seemed like any other slow Sunday. I had restocked the shelves in the morning, and the store was dead. Probably because half the cuxers were busy seeking forgiveness for whatever they'd bought earlier in the week. I distinctly remember it was a Sunday, they had checked the store's inbox, only to slap my forehead when I found it empty. I spent nearly an hour just standing behind the register, absently chewing the same piece of gum, long after it had lost all its flavor, much like my life at that point. Maybe that's why I ended up working there in the first place. Then a man walked in. He was in his early 30s, with long black hair. His looks weren't particularly important, nor was his presence what he brought with him, however was. "Come on, man, let's save the Jesus talk for Sunday school," he said, sliding a VHS tape across the counter. "What's wrong with it? You tell me. I can't even get off to this," he scoffed, casually grabbing a magazine from the nearby rack. "And we'll pay the difference," said I, nodded, apologizing as he took his magazine, undoubtedly off to do whatever unmentionable things with it. Once he was gone, my eyes drifted down to the tape he had returned. The title read XXX. Curious, I pulled the tape from its sleeve. Back in the mid-90s, before streaming services took over, renting adult films was a thing, kind of like a risk version of Blockbuster. At the store, we had a backroom lined with shelves of VHS tapes, available for rent under the same 3-day return policy. It was my job to rewind and clean the tapes before putting them back into circulation, though in all honesty, I barely of bucks an hour. I wasn't exactly motivated. And when I say clean, I mean that in the most literal sense. Some of these cases came back in questionable condition. Strange odors, sticky surfaces, you get the idea. I usually avoided touching them for fear of catching something, but this particular tape, Something about it felt different. With the store still empty, I glanced around, then slipped into the employee break room, a glorified janitor's closet, judging by its size. Inside, there was an old wooden chair and one of those clunky, ancient box TVs. I took its XX, popped it in the weighted. It took nearly a full minute to boot up. Evidently, no one had used the thing in ages. When the screen finally flickered to life, the tape started playing immediately. I hit rewind till the screen went black, then pressed play. The video began abruptly. Right away, I knew something was off. I'd seen my fair share of adult films, but I'd never come across one like this. Instead of live action footage, it was animated. Though crudely so, a cartoon sheep appeared on screen, smiling widely, its large white teeth gleaming against the black backdrop. It bobbed up and down, accompanied by a whimsical, almost childlike smile faded in a frown. The sheep shook its head disapprovingly. "Oh, it looks like you found a naughty film," a cheery voice chimed. "Does the Lord approve of naughty films? Deep down, you know the truth. You know what's bad, and you know what's good. Listen to the good." A stay far away from faded to black. I assumed this was the point where the previous renter had stopped watching and ejected the tape. But moments later, another image flickered onto the screen. A man appeared, standing against a dark background. He wore a sharp black suit and had an almost embarrassed smile. He took a deep breath before speaking. "If you like me, you grew up with this nonsense. Stop your sinning. Repent. Don't have sex. Don't do drugs. But you know what I hear. Don't be free from God himself." His expression hardened. "Sheep eat it up like pig feed. But I spit it out for the hogwash that it is. Maybe you share my views. Maybe you're not as easily controlled as they think. Maybe all you need is a chance." The screen cut to a new image. A group of people, smiling at the camera, standing in front of a large pink building. It looked like a hotel. In unison, they spoke as bold white text flashed across the screen, and TE for EFDT and the entered and a set of coordinates appeared 25.15 N.435U. I paused the tape. Something about this didn't sit right. Remember, this was done in the 90s. There was no Google Maps. If you wanted to find a location, you had to pull out a physical atlas. And why Div realized something strange. The coordinates didn't lead to a city, or a hotel, or anything on land, and pointed to middle of the Atlantic Ocean, just south of Key Largo, Florida. There was a small island nearby, Rodriguez Key, but these coordinates, they led to nowhere. Just open water. I paused several minutes. The coordinates remained on screen, unmoving. Then the screen faded to black once more, and then a new video began. I've watched this footage dozens of times since that day. And while I won't go into the explicit details, let's just say, what I saw next wasn't what I had expected. You'll soon understand why I hand the tape over to the police. The video opened inside a modest hotel room. A queen-sized bed sat in the center, framed by 4 wooden pillars at each corner. Tied to bottom left post by a rope stood a small black goat, shifting uneasily as it glanced around the room. After a moment, its gaze fixed on the door, the kind that typifies adjoining rooms in hotels. Then, from the other side, another goat entered. This one was larger, unmistakably a buck, with thick horns extending from its head. It walked over to the smaller goat, presumably a doe, before rearing onto its hind legs. I won't spell it out, but you can imagine the horror that crept across my face. I slammed the fast forward button. Minutes passed as the grotesque footage played at double speed before finally fading to black. But just as I was about to eject the tape, another scene began. If you have a week, now's the time to stop reading. Then again, if you've made it this far, I doubt you're turning back now. I kept fast forwarding, though I still saw more than enough. The screen code revealing the same hotel room. But now it was filled with people. A dozen or more figures crowded around the bed, where the goat was still mounted on the doe. Along the walls sprawled across the floor, and surrounding the animals were naked men and women, engaging in acts so pre-struggled to put into words. Now, I'd worked at an adult store long enough to know that human depravity has no limits. I'd seen glimpses of this kind of thing before, but what I noticed next made my stomach turn. Some of the people in that room were far younger than I'd initially realized. I couldn't pinpoint their exact ages, but they were clearly too young to be there. And then, in the background, I caught sight of something even worse. Others engaging with animals. I couldn't tell if they were additional goats or more domesticated creatures like dogs. But at that point, it didn't matter. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the TV's power cord from the wall, my breath hitching in my throat as nausea threatened to overtake me. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone and dialed 911. I told the operator everything, the location, the content. Within 30 minutes, an officer arrived at the store. I played over the first 40 seconds of what he grimaced and held up a hand, telling me to stop. I did, wordlessly. He sealed the VHS inside a plastic evidence bag. Expect a follow-up call, he said. I nodded. But the next day, the call never came. And the day after that, still nothing. Days turned into weeks. Yet I never heard from the authorities again. There was no investigation. No case. It was as if none of it had ever happened. I called the police station dozens of times. Every attempt was met with dead ends. No reports, nothing. The officer who had taken the tape vanished. For all I knew, I had imagined the whole thing. But what disturbed me even more was that everything I had, the name of the hotel, the coordinates, pointed to nowhere. For 5 days straight, I pleaded for someone to check the location. Each time, I was told the same thing. The coordinates led to nothing but open ocean, a meaningless blip in the North Atlantic. There was a small island by Rogan's Key, but the exact location listed on the tape. Just endless water. I couldn't accept that. I had to see it for myself. I needed to know I was losing my mind or if I was being lied to. So on a sleep-deprived impulse, I made a decision. I convinced my shift manager to let me take the weekend off, feeding him some excuse about needing a mental break. Then, despite barely having any rest, I got in my car and drove south 9 straight hours. By the time I reached the southernmost tip of the continental United States, the exhaustion had settled into my bones. It didn't stop. The overseas highway stretched before me, weaving through the Florida Keys like a thread over deep blue waters. And then, just before I reached my destination, I saw it, and no signs, no indicators of where it led. In fact, my atlas didn't even acknowledge its existence, and yet it was there, waiting. I continued down a low road that seemed barely finished. The lack of streetlights forced me to slow down and rely on my high beams, illuminating the uneven path and dense trees that lined the way. After about 20 minutes of navigating the dark, winding path, the road finally opened up to a small, desolate bar in the lot and peered out into the pitch-black night. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the rhythmic tacking bobbing against the wooden dock. I moved toward the harbor, following the sound of the swaying vessel. "Good evening," saw, with others shattering the quiet. I jumped, startled to hear another person out here in the middle of nowhere. "Hello." I responded, more question than statement. "Revoice and welcome, Miss Johnson." The voice continued smoothly. I lied, nodding as if the name was mine. "Mr. Johnson," he repeated, his tone oddly cheerful. "Says if freedom you seek here tonight." "Yes," I said, once again answering with uncertainty. In the dim light, I could just make out the figure of a man within the boat. He pulled the vessel closer dock and extended his loan. I approached slowly, the wooden boards creaking under my steps until he hoisted me aboard. "Thank you," I muttered. "Sulnija Johnson," he said, untying the rope and turning the ship's wheel. "Where are we headed?" I asked, trying to mask the tremor in my voice. "Come now," he replied with a knowing smirk. "Save your questions for later. We're only 10 minutes away from DuPont Key, home of the infamous Hold Pleasure." DuPont queued, clutching my worn atlas and scanning the dark waters for any mention of it. "Oh, you won't find it," a man chuckled. Monsieur DuPont valued his secrecy. Get in with the right crowd, and you'd be amazed at the secrets you can keep. Secrets? I pressed, feeling the chill of the night settle into my bones. You seem like a man with many questions, he said. Dit-il dépose a gift from Monsieur Dupont to his late wife. The Duponts were once wealthy landowners in Brittany, with estates across France. But even their wealth couldn't buy freedom. Freedom was something that had to be taken. What kind of freedom? I asked. Monsieur and Madame Dupont were unconventional, he explained. They found a liberation to indulge with whomever they pleased. But in those times, their lifestyle was condemned by the local church and community, and were forced into exile, which eventually led them here, to the Keys, where they established Dupont Key. You won't find it on any US map, he continued, because it's not part of the States, it's its own territory, a sovereign land. As he spoke, I turned missed a dark silhouette rising in the distance, a large structure standing eerily in the middle of the inky waters. The Hotel de Pleasure has always been a refuge, the man continued, his voice carrying an almost reverent tone. A place of freedom for those who escape from society's judgment. What was once taboo is now accepted by many. Our puritanical ancestors were wrong in their convictions. Johnson, but Inas were bound by the choices of yesterday. Imagine the freedoms we'll have tomorrow. The boat slowed as we approached a dock, and a man tying it off with practiced ease. Under the pale moonlight, I finally saw his face, the same man from the video. He smiled, gesturing for me to follow him. Watch your step, he said, pointing toward a path leading to the front doors of the hotel. Once inside, you'll find one of 4 keys. Each grants you access to any room in the hotel. What about the other guests? My nose fraying. They are free to come and go as they please, he replied, leaning in conspiratorially. There are no laws on Dupont Key. Within the hotel do we have legislation. Here we're as free as it gets. Wait, what about murder? I asked hastily, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. And Rand paused, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. To each their own pleasure, he said slowly, nodding with a chilling sense of finality. I stood frozen for a moment, my shock hadn't despite my attempt to mask it. We enjoy your stay, Darius. We hope you find it pleasurable. With that, the man turned away, hopped into the boat, and sailed into the darkness. I still have no idea he knew my real name. It had to be tied to what he said earlier. Something about secrets among the right people. The thought unsettled me, making my skin crawl. At that moment, I wanted nothing more than to turn back. But my only way to the island had just disappeared to the void of the ocean. I was trapped. So much for freedom. With no other choice, I followed a winding path to the towering structure ahead. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, my nerves prickling. The closer I got, and more of the hotel I could make out, it was tall and pointed, almost resembling a church steeple. Its faded pink exterior was accented with trim along the windows and door frames. The entrance was grand, with elegant double doors standing wide and inviting. Yet, despite its outward charm, something about the place felt wrong. A deep, unsettling sensation sat heavy in my chest, like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. Steeling myself, I opened the door. Musk hit me immediately. The scent was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Thick, stale, almost rancid. My face twisted in disgust, but just as quickly. Asked by the artificial freshness of linen and the faint trace of wine that lingered in the air, the lobby was spacious yet eerily empty. Save for a figure slumped against the far wall, a drunk man sat in the corner, laughing to himself. He was barely clothed, save for a leather bondage mask's truptity over his face. Every time he attempted to stand, his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing back down with a muffled groan. Somewhere beyond the lobby, music played, mute distant, its rhythm pulsing through the walls. My gaze drifted across the room, taking in the faded wallpaper, the dim chandeliers casting weak flickering light. Then my eyes landed on the paintings. At first, I thought they were classical, elegant depictions of human forms, and as I focused, my stomach churned. A young woman, completely nude, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Another painting, couples locked in bloody, grotesque embraces. A third, lovers intertwined, but one of them was unmistakably a corpse. The imagery was obscene, more disturbing than anything I'd seen, even at the adult store. At Not Touch slowed. I turned to see the drunk man waving his empty glass above his head, a burp muffled by the tight mask. No. And recackled. I knew I liked you the second you walked in. I offered a stiff nod and moved past him, approaching the front desk. Behind the counter, a rack of keys sat neatly ranged. Each one looked identical without any real direction. I grabbed one and stepped toward the nearby elevator. There was only a single button. As I waited for the chime, my eyes wandered the room once more. And that's when I saw it. Perched on a podium near the desk stood the black goat from the video, and had been stuffed taxidermied in a unnatural pose. Standing in its hind legs, one hoof raised as if in command, the other pointing downward. But that wasn't what unsettled me most. Its anatomy was maroon, not that of a goat but of a human. Both male and female. A shiver ran down my spine, and I tore nays away just as the elevator doors slid open. A couple stood inside, locked in a passionate kiss. At first, I barely registered it. But when one of the men turned and shot me a sharp glare, I realized my face must have betrayed my surprise. They pushed past me and into the lobby, leaving behind a faint trace of cologne and sweat. I reminded myself, this was 1994. Open displays of affection between two men weren't as common then as they are today. But here, in this place, everything seemed different. I stepped inside and hit the third floor button, though I had no particular reason for choosing it. Maybe I was hoping for answers, for something that would make sense of this place. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway lined with plush red carpet. And so, I stepped forward. As the elevator door shut behind, I heard it. It came from all around me, surrounding me like a chorus of crickets on a humid summer night. But much, much louder. The sound seeped through the wooden white doors and stained walls, an overwhelming mix of pleasure, pain, or something in between. Some of the voices gasped in ecstasy, omitted to listen to desperate whimpers, else gan hours begals before melting into groans of undeniable pleasure. I had the key. I could have opened any of those doors, but I just started walking. The noises grew stranger, pounding against walls, against floors, screaming, laughing. Some sounds weren't even human. At least, I couldn't be sure if they were from animals and people unleashing something buried deep inside themselves. Then I stopped. To my left, one room stood eerily silent. I hesitated for only a second, tapping the key into the lock. Turning the handle slowly, I cracked the door open just enough to peek inside. Empty. I wasted no time second shutting the door behind me. No point in locking it. Something told me locks didn't mean much here. The room looked like a hit by a tornado. The bed was in complete disarray, sheets tangled and riddled with stains. Pillows lay strewn across the floor, and the bathroom tiles were slick with moisture. Either I'd arrived before housekeeping, or this place simply didn't have any. The latter seemed far more likely. A sickening realization settled in my there's one of those rooms, the same carpet, the same oversized bed, the same pillars, the same ones from the tape. I slumped into the least filthy-looking chair in the corner, biting my lip as I tried to steady my thoughts. What the hell was I supposed to do now? I had come this far with no plan, no real understanding I was even looking for. Part of me still refused to believe this place existed at all. A bigger part of me wished it didn't. Then, a scream, followed by the sound of a door. I shot up, moving toward the keel. Peering through, I saw them. 6 or so men dragging a struggling woman down the hall. One of them, frustrated by her resistance, hoisted her over his shoulder. They laughed as she thrashed. My stomach twisted. There was something horribly familiar about her. Then it hit me. The nude bride that I had met at the store. Mascara ran down her face in thick, black streaks, nearly making her unrecognizable. But I knew it was her. She was even wearing the same Eerie had sold her. Her husband was nowhere to be seen. None of the men dragging her away resembled the soft, silken young man she had walked in with that day. I gripped the door handle, ready to rush out. But something stopped me. What the hell was I going to do? I couldn't take her on. Even if I could, how would I escape this island with her? My heart pounded as I stood there frozen, helpless, watching as they stepped in the elevator, disappear to some unseen part of the hotel. The second they were gone, I bolted. I rushed down the stairwell next to the elevator, my breath ragged, my hand shaking. A single tear slid down my cheek, an unspoken apology to the bride, to the young couple that had once been so blissfully unaware. Wherever they were now, I shoved open the door to the lobby, making it halfway across the room before a voice stopped me dead in my tracks. Leaving so soon? I turned. He what? He stood in front of the wooden desk, his figure partially obscured by the grotesque, taxidermied goat. I clenched my fists. What kind of sick place this? He smiled, tilting his head ever so slightly. I already told you, Darius. His voice was calm, patient. This has shook my head. These people aren't free. They didn't consent to any of this. Oh, but they did. He stepped forward, his smile never faltering. And the price of freedom, it always requires sacrifice. He paused, then added almost reverently. Some of our guests have chosen to give up their bodies for the pleasure of others. His words made my skin crawl. And for the first time since arriving, I truly wasn't just a visitor, I was a prisoner. And I can't think of a more beautiful thing. The man turned to face the stuffed goat, lifting his head with a serene smile. Or little friend, he has symbolizes harmony. Harmony between man and beast, male and female, good and evil. But tell me, Darius, what is man? What decides what male, female are? What truly defines good and evil? His voice was soft, almost reverent. We have the freedom to choose. Darius. A chime for the lobby. The elevator door slid open, and I couldn't believe my eyes. A group of women stood inside, draped in barely their silks, and bodies bathed in the soft golden glow of the elevator's interior lights. Their eyes smoldered, their lips curled into knowing smiles. They waved, winked, beckoned me forward without a single word. I felt breath hitch. I looked. I couldn't stop myself. The man beside me chuckled, his voice laced with something was fatherly. If you've had a tree, you've been free, have you, Darius? I swallowed hard. Always a slave to appearances, a slave to fear, a slave that ripped himself. He gestured toward the elevator with the open palm, as though offering me a gift. Every day you help others find their pleasure. It's your job. But what about your own to find you pleasure? Why not be true to yourself, if only for one stay? Something inside me cracked. The concern, the hesitation, a trembling anxiety that gripped me since I stepped onto this island. It all seemed to melt away. His words weren't wrong, were they? Maybe I had overacted. Maybe man wasn't trying to deceive me. Maybe he was liberating me. He was right about one thing. I had spent my whole life as an observer, watching other people indulge, live. Few I had never allowed myself to experience. I had let my choices be made by others, by my parents, my bosses, by every guiding hand that told me what was right and wrong. But what if there was no right or wrong? What if there was only choice? That night was the best night of my life. I feel no shame, no guilt, no remorse for what transpired, because I've learned to let those emotions go. For first time, I was free. And ever since that night, I have lived differently. I do not concern myself with the force of right and wrong, good and evil. Those things are constructs. They do not exist. The only truth is the self. What I desire, what I feel, what pleases me, and perhaps you feel it too. Perhaps you are tired of denying it. Maybe you are one of those repressed souls I met so long ago. Locked in the same cycle of self-denial, afraid to give in. Maybe your lover, your spouse, your significant other is not enough. Maybe you crave something different, something taboo. Maybe you simply need a place to be free, even if only for one stay.